In the grand theater of world literature, few adventures shine as brilliantly as those we bring to life. Here on Echoes of Stories. Tonight, the shadows lift, unveiling one of the greatest tales ever written, The Count of Monte Cristo by the legendary Alexandre Dumas. First published in serial form in 1844, this timeless masterpiece has captured hearts for generations, weaving a story of betrayal, vengeance, and redemption. The version you're about to experience comes from the public domain archives of Project Gutenberg, faithfully preserved for all who seek its magic. And now, let the journey unfold. This is The Count of Monte Cristo, Episode 3. As the commissary of police moved through the antechamber, he signaled to two gendarmes who positioned themselves on either side of Dantès, one to his right, the other to his left. A door leading into the Palais de Justice opened, and the small group began a slow passage through a series of long, dim corridors whose oppressive gloom could have unsettled even the bravest spirit. The Palais de Justice connected directly to the prison, a somber structure whose barred windows overlooked the clock tower of the Écoles. After what felt like endless turns, Dantès saw a heavy door fitted with an iron wicket. The commissary lifted an iron mallet and struck it 3 times. To Dantès, each blow echoed like a hammer to his heart. The door swung open. The gendarmes urged him gently forward, and it closed behind him with a deafening finality. The air around him was thick, stale, and suffocating. He was in prison. He was taken to a cell that, though modestly clean, was still secured by bars and iron gratings. Its confinement did not immediately terrify him, especially as Villefort's seemingly sympathetic words still rang in his ears, carrying the promise of freedom. It was 4 o'clock in the afternoon when Dantès was placed there on the 1st of March. Soon darkness enveloped the cell, and in that deep shadow his hearing grew sharper. Every small noise made him leap to the door, convinced that someone was coming to release him, only to sink back in disappointment as the sounds faded away. Hours passed, and around 10 o'clock, just as his hope began to wither, footsteps echoed down the corridor. The key turned, bolts creaked, and the heavy wooden door swung open to reveal the blaze of 2 torches. In their light, Dantès saw the gleam of sabers and carbines carried by 4 gendarmes. Initially, he stepped forward, thinking his release had come, but he halted at the sight of so much armed force. The gendarmes positioned themselves around him, and his earlier anxiety eased slightly when he assumed they had been sent by Villefort. Calmly, he moved into the center of their escort. Outside, a carriage awaited, with a coachman at the box and a police officer beside him. Guided toward it without explanation, Dantès entered, finding himself seated between 2 gendarmes, while 2 more sat opposite. The carriage rumbled heavily over the cobblestone streets. Peering through the grated windows, he realized he had merely exchanged one prison for another, this one moving toward an unknown destination. Through the narrow view, he saw familiar streets, the Rue Caisserie, Rue Saint-Laurent, and Rue Taramis, before reaching the quay. There, the lights of La Consigne came into view. The carriage halted. The officer disembarked and spoke to the guardhouse. Soon, a dozen soldiers emerged, muskets gleaming under the lamps. A silent passageway was formed between the carriage and the port. Ordered to step out, Dantès found himself being led toward a boat held steady by a chain. The soldiers studied him with detached curiosity. Within moments, he was seated at the stern between 2 gendarmes, the officer at the bow, and 4 strong rowers propelling them swiftly toward the open water. At a signal, the port's chain barrier was lowered, and the boat passed into the Frial, leaving the inner harbor behind. The first breath of fresh sea air filled him with a fleeting sense of freedom. But that feeling faded as they passed La Reserve, where he had been so happy only that morning. Now, through open windows, the music and laughter of a ball reached his ears. Folding his hands, he lifted his eyes toward the heavens and prayed. The boat glided past the Tête de Mort, then the Anse du Pharaon, nearing a battery in a maneuver he could not understand. His mind swirled with questions, but no answers came. He wondered if they meant to leave him on some remote shore. He was neither bound nor handcuffed, which seemed a hopeful sign. Villefort's reassurances still echoed in his mind, along with the memory of the destroyed letter, the only evidence against him. As they sailed on, the lighthouse of the Isle Ratonneau slipped by, and soon they were opposite the Pointe de Catalans, where Mercedes lived. Through the dim light, he thought he saw a woman's figure on the beach. One window glowed faintly. It was hers. She was awake, while the rest of the settlement slept. He longed to call out, yet pride restrained him. The shoreline receded. Land now blocked the view, and during his silent reverie, the crew had shipped their oars and raised the sail. The boat, driven by the wind, pushed farther into open sea. Finally, he turned to one of the gendarmes, appealing for information. His request for their destination was met with reluctance, but under pressure, one guard told him to look ahead. Rising to sea, Dantès beheld the dark, forbidding rock of the Château d'If looming in the distance. The sight struck him like a death sentence. That fortress, long steeped in grim legends, was known as a place for political prisoners. Confused and desperate, he tried to insist on his innocence, questioning the absence of any trial or inquiry. The gendarme assured him the formalities had already been completed. At that, Dantès realized Villefort's promises had been meaningless. In a sudden burst of determination, he tried to hurl himself into the sea, but 4 strong arms pulled him back. A knee pinned his chest, and the cold barrel of a carbine pressed against his temple. The threat was clear. One wrong move would mean death here and now. Moments later, the boat struck against the landing. A sailor leapt ashore to secure the mooring line. Dragged by his captors, Dantès climbed the steps toward the fortress gate, a police officer with fixed bayonet behind him. The ascent felt dreamlike. Vague images of soldiers, stone walls, and closing doors passing before his eyes, as if through a heavy mist. He barely noticed the sea, that final and unyielding barrier to freedom. In a walled courtyard, the echo of marching sentinels reached him. For 10 minutes they waited, until an order arrived. A voice instructed the gendarmes to hand over the prisoner. His new escort, an under-jailer with a sullen expression, led him into a damp, almost subterranean cell. The bare walls seemed soaked with the misery of countless tears, a dim lamp casting its feeble glow over this grim space that was now his world. The under-jailer informed Dantès that this would be his chamber for the night. It was late, the governor was asleep, and perhaps in the morning there might be a change. For now, there was bread, water, and fresh straw, everything in the jailer's mind that a prisoner could wish for. Before Dantès could respond, before he could notice where the food and water were placed, or glance at the corner where the straw lay, the jailer was gone. The lamp vanished with him, the heavy door closed, and the last image impressed upon Dantès' mind was the faint glisten of water seeping down the dark, damp walls of his cell. He was left alone, surrounded by darkness and silence, cold shadows brushing against the fevered heat of his forehead. When the first pale light of dawn touched the prison, the jailer returned, this time with orders to keep Dantès exactly where he was. The man found the prisoner still in the same position as before, his eyes swollen from a night of relentless tears. Dantès had stood the entire time, without rest or sleep. Even when the jailer stepped closer, He seemed not to notice until a hand touched his shoulder, startling him from his daze. The jailer asked if he had slept, yet Dantès seemed uncertain even of that. He was questioned about hunger and if he wished for anything, but he had only one request: to see the governor. The man responded with a gesture of indifference before leaving the chamber. Dantès' eyes followed him toward the open doorway, his hands reaching instinctively toward that brief glimpse of freedom. But the door closed once again. It was then that his emotions broke through all restraint. He collapsed onto the ground, sobbing bitterly, asking himself again and again what crime he could have committed to deserve such punishment. The hours crawled by. He scarcely touched the bread or water, pacing the narrow confines of the cell like a caged animal. A single tormenting thought returned to him without mercy: that during his journey to this place, he had remained so still when a dozen times he might have leapt into the sea. He could have relied on his renowned swimming skills to reach the shore, hidden until a Genoese or Spanish vessel arrived, and escaped to Italy or Spain. Mercedes and his father could have joined him there, and, as a skilled seaman, he would have found welcome and work anywhere. Instead, he was trapped in the Château d'If, uncertain of the fate awaiting those he loved, and all because he had trusted Villefort's promise. The thought drove him into a fury, and he hurled himself down upon the straw in despair. The next morning, at the same hour, the jailer appeared once more. He asked if the prisoner was feeling more reasonable, but Dantès gave no answer. The man tried to encourage him, offering to provide anything within his power. Still, Dantès' only request was to see the governor. The refusal was the same as before. It was against the rules, something prisoners were not even allowed to ask. Better food, books, or permission to walk outside could be granted for a price, but the governor remained out of reach. Dantès rejected all other offers, insisting on only this one demand. The jailer warned that if the prisoner kept repeating the same request, he would be denied food altogether. Dantès replied that if so, he would simply die of hunger. Realizing that the prisoner seemed almost eager for death, and knowing that each inmate represented a daily payment for his upkeep, the jailer softened his tone. What Dantès wanted was impossible, he explained, but if he behaved well enough, he might be allowed outside, and perhaps someday meet the governor by chance. Whether the man chose to speak then would be his decision. The wait could be a month, 6 months, or even a year. For Dantès, that was far too long. Brooding over such impossibilities, the jailer warned, would drive a man to madness. He mentioned the example of an abbé who had once occupied the same cell, an inmate who had offered a fortune to the governor for his liberty until he lost his sanity. The man had been removed from this chamber 2 years earlier, not because he was freed, but because he had been placed in a dungeon. Dantès assured the jailer that he was neither a priest nor yet insane, though perhaps one day he might become so. He made a new proposal, not of 1,000,000 francs, which he did not possess, but of 100 crowns if the jailer, on his next trip to Marseilles, would find a young woman named Mercedes of the Catalans and deliver her a short written message. The man refused, saying that if he were caught, he would lose a position worth 2,000 francs a year. Such a risk, in his mind, was not worth the offer. Driven to the edge, Dantès warned that if the jailer refused even to tell Mercedes of his imprisonment, there would come a day when he would hide behind the door and kill him with a stool in his cell. The man recoiled, declaring that this was proof of oncoming madness, just as the abbé had begun, and reminded him that there were dungeons ready for the insane. Dantès lifted the stool as if ready to strike, and the jailer, deciding to yield, promised to inform the governor. The prisoner set the stool down, his posture and manner deliberately giving the impression of a madman. Moments later, The jailer returned with a corporal and 4 soldiers. By the governor's order, the prisoner was to be taken to the level below. The corporal identified it as the dungeon. Without resistance, Dantès followed. He descended 15 steps before being thrust into the darkness of his new cell. The door closed behind him. Stretching his hands forward, he found the cold wall and then lowered himself into a corner, waiting for his eyes to adjust to the shadows. The jailer's words proved almost true. Dantès was now only a breath away from the edge of madness. That evening, Villefort hurried back to Madame de Saint-Mérin's residence in the Place du Grand Cours. Upon entering, he found the guests, whom he had left at the dinner table, now gathered in the salon, sipping coffee. René, along with the others, waited for him with anticipation. The moment he stepped inside, the entire group reacted with a mix of curiosity and concern, eager to know what had drawn him away so abruptly. The company speculated in hushed but animated tones, wondering if his return signaled some grave political matter or perhaps a dangerous development involving the ever-feared Corsican exile. Villefort approached the Marquise, his future mother-in-law, to apologize for his sudden departure. Then, turning to the Marquis, he requested a few moments of private discussion. The Marquis, noting the tension clouding Villefort's expression, understood the urgency and agreed. Villefort explained that the matter was serious enough to require his absence for several days. He asked René to judge for herself the importance of his mission, her visible distress making his announcement even heavier. When questioned about his destination, he explained that it was an official matter he could not openly discuss. Still, he offered to pass along any errands for Paris through a trusted acquaintance traveling there that very night. The Marquis led him into the library, where Villefort revealed that an urgent political situation demanded his immediate presence in Paris. Without delay, he asked the Marquis if his fortune was invested in property or other holdings. Learning that the Marquis's wealth was tied entirely to government funds, Villefort urged him to sell everything at once, warning that any delay could mean total financial loss. Realizing the potential danger, the Marquis swiftly wrote an order to his broker to sell at the current market price. Villefort tucked the letter into his pocketbook and immediately requested another, this one intended for the king. The Marquis hesitated, unwilling to address the king directly, but Villefort clarified that the letter should instead be written by the Comte de Salvieux, granting him access to the king without the usual formalities that would cost valuable time. Villefort explained that reaching the Tuileries first was vital to ensuring the credit and reward for his discovery, without sharing the glory with others. Understanding the urgency, the Marquis agreed and prepared to call Salvieux while urging Villefort to get ready for immediate departure. Villefort promised to make his farewells in person to the Marquise and René before leaving. A servant was sent to summon Salvieux, and Villefort stepped outside to prepare. Yet, aware that running through the streets in such haste might alarm the city, he adopted a calmer pace. Near his doorway, he noticed a solitary figure waiting in the shadows. It was Mercedes, who, unable to bear the uncertainty about her fiancé, had come quietly to inquire about him. Recognizing her from Dantès' earlier mention, Villefort was struck by her beauty and dignity. When she asked about her lover's fate, Villefort, feeling cornered like a defendant before a judge, informed her bluntly that the young man was accused of a grave crime and beyond his help. Overcome with grief, Mercedes pleaded at least to know whether Dantès was alive. Villefort answered that the prisoner was no longer in his custody, offering nothing more. He ended the exchange abruptly, pushing past her and closing the door, as if shutting out the sting of guilt. But remorse clung to him, sharp and inescapable, like an arrow lodged in the wound of a wounded hero. When he returned to the salon, Villefort released a deep sigh, almost a sob, and sank heavily into a chair. The first pangs of an unending torment gripped Villefort's heart. In his mind's eye, the man he had sacrificed to ambition, the innocent victim offered upon the altar of his father's sins, appeared before him, pale and menacing, leading his betrothed by the hand. Alongside them came remorse, not as the ancients had imagined it, wild, furious, and terrifying, but as a slow, consuming agony, its pain deepening hour by hour until the moment of death. For the first time, hesitation crept in. He had often demanded the death penalty for criminals, and thanks to his irresistible eloquence, verdicts had been secured without the slightest shadow of regret crossing his brow. Then, he had believed them guilty, and his conscience had remained untroubled. But now, he stood over the ruin of an innocent man's life. In this case, he was not the judge, he was the executioner. As these thoughts turned over in his mind, the unfamiliar sensation grew within him, a vague, gnawing dread. It was like the instinctive tremor of a wounded man when a finger draws near the injury. Yet this wound of Villefort's was one that would never heal, or if it did, it would only close long enough to reopen with greater agony. At that moment, had René's gentle voice pleaded for mercy, or had Mercedes entered, invoking the name of God and begging for the return of her betrothed, Villefort's cold, trembling hands would have signed the prisoner's release. But no voice disturbed the stillness. The silence was broken only by his valet, announcing that the traveling carriage was ready. Villefort rose, almost sprang, from his chair, opened a desk drawer, and emptied all the gold within into his pocket. For a brief moment he stood motionless, pressing a hand to his forehead, muttering incoherent words. Then, as his servant placed a cloak upon his shoulders, he strode out and leapt into the carriage, instructing the postilions to drive to Monsieur de Saint-Mérin's. The fate of Edmond Dantès was sealed. As promised, the Marquis awaited him, with the Marquise and René at his side. Villefort started slightly at the sight of René, fearing she might again intercede for Dantès. But her emotions were entirely personal. She thought only of his departure, of losing him at the very moment he was to become her husband. Villefort could not say when he might return, and far from pleading for the accused, René harbored resentment toward the man whose supposed crime kept her from her fiancé. Elsewhere, Mercedes had encountered Fernand at the corner of the Rue de la Loge. She had returned to the Catalans and thrown herself despairingly upon her couch. Fernand knelt at her side, taking her hand and covering it with kisses she did not feel. She remained unmoving through the night. When the lamp burned out for lack of oil, she ignored the darkness. When dawn arrived, she was unaware of the day. Her grief allowed her to see only one image, Edmond. Meanwhile, Monsieur Morel refused to surrender the fight. Learning that Dantès had been imprisoned, he sought the help of friends and influential citizens. But the rumor was already spreading. Dantès had been arrested as a Bonapartist agent. And since even the most hopeful considered Napoleon's return to the throne impossible, Morel's appeals were met only with refusal. He returned home in despair, declaring the matter hopeless. Catullus, restless and uneasy, chose a different refuge. Instead of aiding Dantès, he shut himself in with 2 bottles of black currant brandy, hoping to drown his thoughts. Yet he failed, becoming too intoxicated to fetch more drink, but not so far gone as to forget the events of the day. He sat at a table between 2 empty bottles, elbows propped, watching ghostly visions dance in the flicker of an unsnuffed candle. Specters like those Hoffman scattered over his punch-soaked pages, black and grotesque as dust in the night. Only Danglars felt content and joyful. He had eliminated an enemy and secured his position aboard the Pharaon. Danglars was the sort of man born with a pen behind his ear and an inkstand in place of a heart. To him, everything was a matter of addition and subtraction. The life of a man weighed far less than a figure on a ledger, especially if by erasing it, he could increase the sum of his own ambitions. He retired at his usual hour and slept soundly. Villefort, after receiving Monsieur de Savuse's letter, embraced Renée, kissed the Marquise's hand, and shook the Marquise. Then, without delay, he set off for Paris by way of the Aix road. Back in Marseilles, the elder Dantès was nearly dying from the torment of not knowing what had become of his son. But the truth was known to us and to Villefort. Edmond Dantès' fate had been decided. Villefort was left speeding toward Paris, his journey hastened by generous fees, while the scene shifted to the Tuileries. Passing through several rooms, one entered a small chamber with an arched window, a place long favored by Napoleon and Louis XVIII, and now by Louis Philippe. Inside, King Louis XVIII sat at a walnut table brought from Hartwell, a piece of furniture to which he was curiously attached. As he jotted marginal notes in a well-worn edition of Horace, the imperfect yet highly sought-after Griffius version, he half listened to a distinguished gentleman in his early 50s. This man, gray-haired and refined in manner, spoke with aristocratic poise, but his tone carried concern. The king responded with mild humor, sometimes deflecting, sometimes amused, showing the easy wit of a man who preferred pleasantry to alarm. Yet the courtier persisted, hinting at unrest brewing in the south and urging the monarch to send trustworthy agents into Languedoc, Provence, and Dauphiné. Louis, intent on his annotations, brushed off the unease, citing favorable weather, as if political climate could be measured the same way. Still, he allowed the discussion to continue, occasionally interrupting for his own remarks and small asides. Their conversation was soon joined by the Minister of Police, Baron d'André, who entered at the king's invitation. Louis directed the Baron to brief the Duke on the latest intelligence from Elba. The minister reported that Napoleon seemed restless and bored, spending his days watching miners at work in Port Alongan, idly skimming stones across the water, and showing odd swings between laughter and tears. Some took these behaviors as signs of madness. The king, however, suggested they could just as easily be the habits of great men at leisure. Blocas listened, caught between the monarch's confidence and the minister's certainty. The king then spoke of Napoleon's supposed change of heart, recounting that the former emperor had recently released a few veterans who wished to return to France, encouraging them to serve their good king. Still, the Duke advised questioning a messenger who had brought him alarming news. The king agreed, but with a note of skepticism. Baron d'André was sent to check for any new reports, or, failing that, to create one, as the king joked, while Blocas prepared to summon his informant. Before parting, Louis remarked that the Duke's heraldry ought to bear an eagle gripping its prey, marked with a single word, Tenex. De Blocas, restless and impatient, listened as the king sought his opinion on a particular passage from Horace, likening it to a stag fleeing a wolf. The Duke, eager to return to his true purpose, compared his own messenger to that hunted animal, having traveled over 200 leagues in just 3 days. Louis XVIII lightly pointed out that such effort was unnecessary when a telegraph could send messages within hours without such exertion. Yet the Duke pressed on, urging the king to receive the young man graciously, particularly because he came with a recommendation of M. de Salvieux, the king's brother's chamberlain. Only when the messenger's name was spoken, Villefort, did the king's expression shift to mild unease. Recognizing the man as ambitious and shrewd, and recalling that he was the son of Noirtier, Once a Girondin and senator, the king concluded that such ambition would outweigh any loyalty to family. Permission was given to present him immediately. The duke returned swiftly with Villefort, overcoming the resistance of the master of ceremonies, who objected to the young magistrate's dusty, travel-worn clothing. At last, Villefort stood before the king, who invited him forward to speak. Villefort began by acknowledging the urgency of his message, explaining that he had come with all possible speed to report the discovery of not a minor disturbance, but a genuine conspiracy threatening the throne itself. The usurper, Napoleon, was preparing 3 ships and, at that very moment, might have already left Elba for an unknown destination, possibly Naples, Tuscany, or even the coast of France. Villefort described how his suspicions had been confirmed through the interrogation of a turbulent sailor from Marseilles, recently returned from Elba, who carried a verbal message intended for a Bonapartist contact in Paris. This message, though incomplete in detail, suggested the imminent return of Napoleon. The man was now in prison, and the gravity of the situation had compelled Villefort to abandon his own betrothal celebration to Mademoiselle de Saint-Méran, the daughter of a loyal royalist, so that he could deliver the warning without delay. The king listened, weighing the claim. While he admitted that conspiracies were easy to imagine and harder to execute, he pointed to the coalition's vigilance over the Mediterranean and the likely failure of any such landing. Even so, he assured Villefort of royal gratitude for his loyalty. At that moment, de Blocas announced the arrival of Baron d'André, the Minister of Police. Pale and trembling, the Baron entered, his expression betraying a seriousness that caused Villefort to pause, until de Blocas placed a restraining hand on him, keeping him in the room. At the sight of the minister's agitation, Louis XVIII abruptly pushed away the table in front of him. The Baron stood pale and unsettled, and though de Blocas moved toward him, the courtier's visible distress persuaded restraint. In truth, the moment favored the prefect of police far more if he prevailed over the duke than if he were humiliated. Struggling to compose himself, the minister hesitated before revealing the news. At last, under the king's command, he confessed that Napoleon had departed from Elba on February 26th and had landed on March 1st. Not in Italy, but in France itself, at a small port near Antibes in the Gulf of Juan. The revelation seemed impossible to the king, who could not believe that such a momentous event had occurred 2 days earlier without his knowing. Yet the minister swore it was true, forcing Louis to confront the alarming fact that his enemy had set foot on French soil, a mere 250 leagues from Paris. Anger and dread flashed across the king's features. He accused those tasked with guarding Napoleon of either gross negligence or secret complicity. De Blocas defended the minister's honor, suggesting instead that the blindness had been general across all ranks of authority. Villefort began to speak sharply, then checked himself, apologizing for his tone. The king urged him to speak freely, reminding him that he had been the first to sound the warning. Villefort explained that the usurper was despised in the south, and that if he moved through Languedoc or Provence, it might be possible to raise the populace against him. The minister agreed, but reported that Napoleon was advancing instead by way of Gap and Sisteron, a route pointing toward Paris. When the king asked about Dauphiné, Villefort regretfully admitted that the region's sentiment was entirely different. The mountaineers there were devoted Bonapartists. This prompted Louis to realize that Napoleon had chosen his route with precision. When pressed for the size of the invading force, the minister admitted he did not know, explaining that the official dispatch contained only the fact of the landing and the route taken. The king's tone grew cold, mocking the oversight. The minister added, with visible embarrassment, that the information had arrived by telegraph. At this, Louis stepped forward, folding his arms across his chest in a manner eerily reminiscent of the very man. whose return now threatened his reign. The king's face grew pale with anger as he spoke, recalling how 7 united armies had overthrown a single man. He reflected bitterly that, after 25 years of exile, a miracle from heaven had restored him to the throne of his ancestors. Those years, he thought, had been spent in tireless study of the French people and the interests entrusted to him. Yet now, with his long-cherished hopes within reach, the very power in his grasp seemed to shatter in his hands. The minister murmured that it was fate, as though the weight of circumstance was too great for human endurance. The king's tone sharpened with sarcasm, lamenting that his enemies were right. They had learned nothing and forgotten nothing. He felt betrayed not by open foes, but by those he himself had elevated to honor, who should have guarded him more carefully than their own lives. Before him, they had been nothing. After him, they would be nothing, doomed to perish in their own incompetence. He declared a fatality once again. The minister shrank before this cutting outburst, while M. de Blocas wiped his brow. Villefort, however, silently welcomed the shift in the room, sensing his own rising importance. The king, fully aware of the peril hanging over the monarchy, declared that to learn of such a downfall by telegraph was more humiliating than the fate of his executed brother, Louis XVI. Ridicule, he said, was more feared in France than many understood, and it was driving him from the Tuileries. Summoning Villefort, the king called him forward, instructing him to demonstrate that it was possible to know beforehand what others had failed to learn. Villefort explained that it was impossible to uncover the secrets hidden so carefully by that one man. The king challenged the word impossible, pointing out that, while his minister had offices, agents, spies, and vast fund for secret service, he had still failed to learn what a simple magistrate had discovered without such resources, knowledge that might have saved the crown if only he had been able to control the telegraph. The police minister's eyes burned with resentment toward Villefort, who bowed his head modestly. The king then commended M. de Blocas for his persistence in suspicion, unlike others who might have dismissed Villefort's disclosures. Villefort recognized the praise, but, wary of making a powerful enemy, offered humility. He attributed his foresight not to skill, but to chance and loyalty. This gesture earned him a silent but significant thanks from the police minister, forging a cautious alliance. Satisfied, the king dismissed the 2 senior officials, noting that the matter now belonged to the Minister of War. M. de Blocas assured him the army's loyalty was certain, but the king dismissed such reports, asking instead about the affair in the Rue Saint-Jacques. Villefort, startled, excused his lapse in etiquette. The police minister began to give his findings, but the king insisted the death of General Canol might be linked to a greater conspiracy. At the name, Villefort trembled. The minister reported that Canol's death was likely assassination, not suicide. The general had left a Bonapartist club before meeting with an unknown man, whose description matched someone seen the previous day, but who had escaped pursuit. Villefort, shaken, steadied himself when he learned the suspect had slipped away. The king ordered the search to continue, vowing harsh justice if the killing proved political. Villefort controlled his fear, hiding the depth of his anxiety. The king criticized the police for thinking their task complete once a murder was declared and a suspect's trail found. The minister promised satisfaction. Dismissing Villefort to rest from his journey, the king inquired about his father. Villefort revealed he had not visited, going instead directly to M. de Blocas. The king, aware of the poor relations between father and son, called it another sacrifice for the royal cause. Villefort replied that the king's kindness was reward enough. Removing the cross of the Legion of Honor from his own coat, the king presented it to Villefort, instructing M. de Blocas to have the brevet prepared. Tears of pride filled Villefort's eyes as he accepted the decoration. He asked for his next orders, and the king directed him to rest and prepare to serve in Marseilles if needed. Villefort promised to leave Paris within the hour. As Villefort departed, the police minister remarked that fortune had favored him. Villefort, noting the minister's career was ending, muttered to himself while hailing a passing coach. At his hotel, he ordered horses for 2 hours later and asked for breakfast. He was about to begin his meal when the sharp ring of the bell interrupted him, followed by his valet announcing that someone was asking for him by name. Villefort was startled by the sharp thought that no one should have known he was there so soon. His valet stepped in, explaining that someone had come, refusing to give a name. The visitor, however, had specifically asked for Villefort. When pressed for details, the servant described a man of about 50 years, roughly the same height as Villefort, with a complexion and features that were strikingly dark, black hair, black eyes, and heavy black brows. His clothing was formal, a blue frock coat fastened to the chin, adorned with the rosette of the Legion of Honor. The description drained the color from Villefort's face. Recognition was instant and unsettling. Before he could speak further, the man himself entered, moving with the confidence of someone entitled to be there. His presence carried a certain familiarity, and the sharp edge in his tone made clear that he considered the delay in being admitted an unnecessary formality. In that moment, Villefort realized his suspicion had been correct. The visitor was none other than his father. The older man set his cane in the corner, placed his hat on a chair, and remarked on the lack of welcome with the air of someone accustomed to authority. Villefort, masking his emotions, instructed his valet to leave them. The servant withdrew, still visibly surprised by the encounter. It was indeed M. Noirtier who entered the room. He quietly watched the servant until the door closed, and then, as though suspecting that someone might be listening in the antechamber, he reopened it. His suspicion proved correct, for Germain retreated quickly, evidence enough of his curiosity. With deliberate care, Noirtier shut and bolted the antechamber door, then secured the bedchamber door as well, before extending his hand toward Villefort. The young man, having followed every movement with visible surprise, could not entirely hide his reaction. Villefort's father regarded him with a significant expression, noting that his son seemed less than thrilled to see him. The young magistrate, however, insisted that his father's visit was a pleasant surprise, though one that had left him somewhat overwhelmed. Noirtier, taking a seat, observed that he too could claim surprise, given that Gerard had announced his wedding for the 28th of February and yet appeared in Paris on the 3rd of March. Villefort explained that his unexpected journey was entirely for his father's benefit, believing it would secure his safety. Intrigued, Noirtier invited him to explain, reclining with ease. Villefort began by asking if his father had heard of a certain Bonapartist club in the Rue Saint-Jacques. Noirtier confirmed, almost casually, that he not only knew of it, he was the vice president. His calmness unsettled Villefort, but Noirtier merely reminded him that, after surviving proscription by the mountaineers, escaping Paris in a hay cart, and being hunted across the plains of Bordeaux by Robespierre's agents, one grew accustomed to many dangers. Villefort went on, explaining that General Canel had been lured to the club and later found dead in the Seine after leaving his home at 9 in the evening. The king himself had relayed the news. In return, Noirtier offered to share his own account. Villefort suspected he already knew what it was, the recent landing of the emperor. Urging caution, Villefort revealed that he had known of this even before Noirtier, for he had raced from Marseilles to Paris 3 days earlier, desperate to act. His father scoffed, pointing out that 3 days prior the emperor had not yet landed. Villefort countered that he knew of the plan from a letter sent to Noirtier from the island of Elba, intercepted in a messenger's pocketbook. Had it fallen into other hands, his father might already have been executed. Villefort had burned the letter to protect him. Noirtier remarked that such destruction had preserved not only his own safety, but also his son's future. Villefort insisted he had gone further. He had saved him. This brought the conversation back to the Rue Saint-Jacques Club, which was now attracting police attention. Noirtier dismissed this as a familiar claim. When the police failed, they claimed to be on the track. But Villefort warned that a corpse had been found, and the king considered it murder. His father doubted it, arguing that drownings in the Seine were not uncommon, and that January's cold waters hardly proved intent. Villefort, however, insisted the general had been killed. To Noirtier, politics contained no murder, only the removal of obstacles. He recounted how General Canel had been recommended by allies from Elba, invited to meet sympathetic friends, and presented with a plan for the emperor's return. When Canel declared himself a royalist, he was still permitted to leave freely, yet never made it home. Noirtier suggested the man had simply lost his way. Villefort was startled by this reasoning, but his father reminded him that when Gerard, acting as a royalist, had condemned one of Noirtier's own allies, he had never accused him of murder, only acknowledged that political tides change. Villefort warned that when those tides turned, vengeance would be severe. Noirtier, confident in the emperor's advance toward Grenoble, Lyons, and eventually Paris, dismissed such fears. He believed the people would meet the emperor with open arms, that the armies sent against him would instead escort him, and that royalist cities would not resist. He even proved how well-informed his side was by revealing he had known of Villefort's arrival within half an hour of his passing the city barrier, despite his son telling no one but his postilion. Villefort admitted his father seemed remarkably well-informed, but Noirtier explained that those awaiting power relied not on money but on devotion, what he called hopeful ambition. As he reached for the bell rope to summon dinner for two, Villefort stopped him, saying there was one more matter. The royalist police, however inept, knew something dangerous: the description of a man seen at General Canel's home on the morning he vanished. The description matched a dark-complexioned man with black hair, eyebrows, and whiskers, wearing a blue frock coat buttoned to the chin, bearing the rosette of an officer of the Legion of Honor, a wide-brimmed hat, and carrying a cane. Hearing this, Noirtier simply remarked on the thoroughness of the police, then wondered aloud why such a man had not already been arrested. The authorities, Villefort explained, had lost track of the suspect the day before at the corner of the Rue Coquerin. This, to Noirtier, only confirmed his opinion that the police were useless. Villefort maintained that the man might still be captured, but his father noted that only a careless fugitive would be caught, and this particular one was far too cautious. Smiling faintly, Noirtier remarked that such a person would simply alter his appearance. With that, he stood, removed his frock coat and cravat, and walked to the table where his son's grooming items were kept. Lathering his face, he took a razor in hand and, without hesitation, removed the whiskers that had made him so easily identifiable. Villefort observed, his concern mingled with reluctant admiration. When the whiskers were gone, Noirtier changed the part in his hair, replaced the black cravat with a colored neckerchief from an open portmanteau, and exchanged his high-buttoned blue frock coat for one of Villefort's dark brown coats, cut away in the front. He tried on a narrow-brimmed hat belonging to his son, finding a perfect fit, left his cane in the corner, and picked up a light bamboo switch. Giving it a few playful cuts through the air, he strolled about with that confident swagger so characteristic of him. Once the transformation was complete, he asked his son whether the police would still recognize him. Villefort admitted that he hoped not. Noirtier then entrusted him with the task of removing all the items he had left behind. Villefort promised, and his father acknowledged that perhaps his son truly had saved his life, something for which he would repay him one day. Yet Villefort remained unsure, hoping instead that his father might simply be mistaken. Noirtier inquired whether his son would meet the king again. If so, he suggested that Gerard could either act as a prophet or keep his counsel, warning that bearers of ill news rarely found favor at court, though history often vindicated them later. He even offered the precise words Villefort might deliver, an unflinching message declaring that France's mood, the sentiments of its towns, and the loyalty of its army had been misjudged. The man called the Corsican ogre in Paris was already Bonaparte in Lyons and Emperor in Grenoble. Far from being hunted down, he advanced as swiftly as his eagles, soldiers rallying to him like snowflakes to a rolling ball. Noirtier urged that the king should leave France to its true master, not out of fear for his life, since the adversary was powerful enough to grant mercy, but to avoid the humiliation of owing his safety to the man of Arcola, Marengo, and Austerlitz. Still, he advised his son to say nothing, to keep his Paris journey secret, to return home under cover of night, and to remain silent, submissive, and harmless. This, he promised with a knowing smile, would be another way of protecting him if political fortune ever reversed their positions. With this counsel given, Noirtier departed as calmly as he had spoken throughout the entire tense exchange. Pale and unsettled, Villefort moved to the window and pulled back the curtain, watching his father walk past 2 or 3 rough-looking men at the street corner. Men who might well have been waiting to arrest someone with black whiskers, a blue frock coat, and a broad-brimmed hat. Only when his father disappeared at the Rue Bussy did Villefort turn to the objects left behind. He hid the black cravat and blue frock coat deep in the portmanteau, tossed the hat into a dark closet, broke the cane into pieces, and fed it to the fire, then put on his traveling cap. Summoning his valet, he silenced the flood of questions with a look, settled his bill, and leapt into his waiting carriage. News reached him at Lyons that Bonaparte had entered Grenoble, and amid the feverish excitement along the road, he finally arrived in Marseilles, his mind consumed by the turbulent mix of hopes and fears that ambition and its earliest victories bring to the human heart.